The Betrayal of Mandela's Dream, South Africa's Broken Legacy. I remember vividly the year 1999, when Nelson Mandela, the man who had become not only the father of South Africa but also a moral compass for the entire world, finally stepped down from power. It was an emotional moment that felt almost surreal, because many of us had grown so accustomed to seeing him as the embodiment of leadership that the thought of his absence was frightening. Mandela had never clung to power, never sought to rule indefinitely. He had always promised to serve only one term, and true to his word, he retired with grace. As he left the Union buildings for the last time as president, millions of South Africans were left with tears in their eyes, wondering what the future would bring. He had carried us through the most fragile years of democracy, turning potential bloodshed into reconciliation. But now the question hung heavy in the air. Without Mandela's wisdom, could the Rainbow Nation truly endure? His departure felt both like the end of an era and the beginning of an uncertain journey. When Thabo Mbeki took over as president, many believed he would be the ideal successor to Mandela. He was a man of education, articulate, polished, and deeply respected abroad. At first, his quiet demeanor gave the impression of stability, as though he would bring a steady hand to guide the nation forward. But quickly, his leadership revealed dangerous flaws. Instead of embodying Mandela's warmth and ability to unite, Mbeki seemed distant, disconnected from ordinary South Africans who struggled daily in the townships. His cold intellectualism made him admired in boardrooms, but feared in communities. The most devastating failure came with his denial of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. While millions cried out for treatment, he publicly questioned whether the virus even caused the disease. This denial, cloaked in pseudoscience, cost the lives of more than 300,000 South Africans, mothers and children who might have lived if leadership had been compassionate. The promise of continuity after Mandela, instead, became the beginning of erosion. Mbeki's government stabilized certain sectors of the economy, but he failed to inspire, and worse, he failed to protect the most vulnerable. The dream of equality began to flicker and dim under his rule. Then came Jacob Zuma, and with him, perhaps the most painful betrayal of Mandela's legacy. Zuma had a very different persona. He was charismatic, charming, often laughing and dancing in public, singing the songs of liberation that connected him to the struggles of the past. To many poor South Africans, he seemed approachable, a man who understood their hardships. But behind the charm was corruption so deep it would nearly collapse the country. Zuma surrounded himself with powerful business families and foreign interests who manipulated government contracts, drained state coffers, and transformed South Africa into a playground for the corrupt. Scandals erupted one after another, each revealing more shocking levels of greed and betrayal. The economy stagnated, unemployment worsened, and faith in the ANC crumbled. For the first time since 1994, people began to question whether democracy itself had failed them. Zuma's rule was not only a betrayal of Mandela's vision, it was a turning point where hope was replaced by cynicism. Each day under his leadership seemed to push the dream of the Rainbow Nation further into the shadows. I will never forget the scandal that came to symbolize the depths of corruption under Jacob Zuma, Nkandla. The very word became synonymous with betrayal. In a country where millions live in shacks of corrugated iron, without electricity or running water, Zuma used public funds to build himself a sprawling mansion worth the equivalent of 200 million reais. They called it security upgrades, but everyone knew the truth. A lavish swimming pool was absurdly labeled a firefighting reservoir. A cattle enclosure was defended as vital protection, and even a chicken coop was justified. The arrogance was breathtaking. Ordinary South Africans who struggled just to put food on the table watched their president flaunt his luxury as though he were a king. I remember the anger in the streets, the protests, the chants calling for justice, and yet Zuma laughed, often breaking into song in Parliament as his allies shielded him from accountability. Nkandla was not just about money, it was about the moral collapse of leadership. By 2018, the pressure had become unbearable. Zuma's presidency was collapsing under the weight of scandals, investigations, and public fury. The ANC, the very party of Mandela, could no longer protect him without destroying itself. It was a moment heavy with symbolism. 70 years after the official beginning of apartheid in 1948, South Africa once again faced a defining choice. Would it allow corruption to bury democracy, or would it rise and fight for the dream that had been betrayed? I remember watching the news when Zuma finally resigned, not out of dignity, but because his own comrades forced him out. Crowds cheered, but the celebration was bitter. It felt less like a victory and more like a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. For many, it was too late. Billions had been stolen, institutions weakened, and faith in government shattered. Mandela had stepped down willingly, with grace and honor. Zuma was dragged out, clinging to power until the last possible moment. The contrast between these two leaders was a stark reminder of how far we had fallen from the promise of 1994. When Cyril Ramaphosa rose to power after Zuma's downfall, a cautious wave of hope returned. Ramaphosa was no stranger to Mandela's vision. He had been one of the key negotiators in the early 1990s, a man who understood both the struggle and the need for reconciliation. People believed that perhaps, finally, someone would restore dignity to the ANC. His speeches were measured. His tone carried echoes of Mandela's humanity, and he spoke of cleaning up corruption and reviving the economy. But the rot Zuma had left behind was deeper than anyone could have imagined. State-owned enterprises were hollowed out, entire ministries were infested with patronage networks, and the ANC itself was divided into bitter factions. Ramaphosa promised reform, but every move he made was resisted by entrenched power brokers who thrived on corruption. South Africans wanted to believe in him, but trust had been broken too many times. For me, Ramaphosa symbolized not so much a new dawn, but a fragile candle flickering in the darkness, struggling to stay alive against the winds of betrayal. Hope was back, yes, but it was fragile, almost fragile enough to break. I measure the fragility of our democracy in numbers that feel like open wounds. Unemployment hovers around a level that steals breath, roughly 1 in 3 adults without work, and among the youth it is even crueler, a sentence handed down before a first chance was given. I see graduates carrying CVs like prayer books, moving from gate to gate, and mothers stretching grocery money until it becomes a thin, anxious thread. Load shedding darkens homes and small shops, turning ambition into flickering candles. Clinics run short of basics. Service delivery protests become the language of those who no longer believe anyone is listening. In townships where promise once walked proudly, classrooms drown in overcrowding, and talented teachers fight burnout while children memorize hunger more easily than time's tables. The economy limps, and with each lurch, another family. These are not abstract percentages to me. They are neighbors pawning heirlooms, cousins migrating, friends choosing between minibus fare and dinner. The statistics speak plainly. Growth without inclusion is a mirage, and a flag cannot feed a child. We were promised opportunity. What many of us received instead was permanent precarity. The distance between the penthouse and the pavement is now a canyon so wide that many insist it feels deeper than in the last years of apartheid, only rearranged with new beneficiaries. I walk past gated estates guarded by private security and then through townships where tap water arrives sporadically, if at all. We replaced passbooks with boom gates and biometric scanners, mapped new borders with electric fences and homeowner WhatsApps. Social mobility, once the anthem of our transition, stalls on potholes and paperwork. Spatial apartheid survives in commute times that steal parents from their children, and in property deeds that still whisper the names of old advantages. We celebrate isolated success stories, but the ladder is missing rungs, and the floor beneath the poor keeps giving way. Inequality is not just a number. It is the daily humiliation of talent unused, the corrosion of trust, the silent scream of a nation that knows it could be more and yet remains less. Some nights, Johannesburg sounds like a heart with an irregular beat, sirens, dogs, a distant crack that may be a backfire or a gunshot. We learn which streets to avoid, how to look twice at ATMs, how to drive with windows cracked just enough to reduce glare, but not enough to invite a quick hand. Friends trade tips like medics in a field tent, avoid load-shedding slots, vary routes, never stop for a stranger after midnight. It feels at times more perilous than places the news calls war zones, because our conflict has no front line. Danger commutes with us. Hijackings, home invasions, gender-based violence, syndicates stripping copper and rail. Each story arrives with a name attached, not a statistic. Communities fortify behind palisades and electric wire, while informal justice flares in alleys where police arrive too late or not at all. And cameras, couples schedule joy around curfews. Entrepreneurs factor in security before hiring a first employee. I often think of how sport still carries a torch in this divided land. Yet when the final whistle blows, the illusion dissolves. Rugby, football, cricket, they give us moments of unity, glimpses of what we might be if we chose harmony over suspicion. But moments are not permanence. The fields of Ellis Park and Loftus Versfeld remind us of our potential. In 2023, when the Springboks lifted the Webb Ellis Trophy again, I felt something close to déjà vu. For a few fleeting days, it felt as though Mandela's dream still had breath. Can a nation survive on symbolic victories when daily life is punctured by despair? And when it does, the problems we ignore return with double weight. Sometimes I close my eyes and ask myself what Mandela would think if he walked the streets of South Africa today. He warned us that freedom alone was not enough, that democracy must deliver dignity. His eyes would burn with disappointment at how far we have strayed, but I also think he would not surrender hope.